Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice high-end teeth whitening kit, but don't tell them you've secretly replaced the whitener with red hair dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove. And then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road. And, the car, the Camaro, had been driving completely normally to that point. So what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel and she's not looking up at him. She's not making any sound. She's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up. But there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk, but she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency. But they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive. But it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. I mean, despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity. But they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet. But remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're gonna go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're gonna ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible. A ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. Hey guys! Did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now. Plus, there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the MrBallen podcast and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories. On the evening of September 17th, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house. But unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer, and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door. He opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason. And Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris. And Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised. But at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him. And the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid. And so Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible. And Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there. But at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours, basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed, and the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music, and it was being played at a very high volume basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation. And so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music, that's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage. And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning. And what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep, and then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it, because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself, because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people. But there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas. Of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are going to stay home and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door, and he was gone. And as soon as Ka was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not gonna make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car, and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw 2 women in the front 2 seats of this car slumped over. The 2 women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the two women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these two women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these two women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the two women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is gonna leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e. don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim's son was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. All right, so today I'm gonna be making a very special announcement at some point in this YouTube video. I'm not gonna tell you what the announcement is now, of course, but I'll give you a little hint. We're gonna be adding something to the Ballen universe. So be sure you stick around to hear today's announcement. Today, I'm gonna share 3 totally bizarre missing person stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice fresh ice cream cone, but don't tell them you've secretly hid a glass shard in the middle of it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of October 11, 2016, a middle-aged man named Carlos Herrera Sr. entered the visitation area of a prison in Venezuela. The room itself sort of looked like a high school cafeteria, with tables and chairs everywhere for the inmates and their visitors to sit down and have their meetings. And right in front of Juan was one table where there was this bedraggled-looking prisoner who he was there to meet. As Juan got closer to this guy, he could see he really looked terrible, the inmate. I mean, his cheekbones were sticking out, he was sort of emaciated, he was bloodied and bruised, he had bandages on his arm. And also, as Juan moved towards this guy, he could clearly see all the guards that lined the walls and the exits of this visitation area sort of squirm with discomfort, as this meeting is about to take place. And Juan had a good idea why these guards might be anxious. And that's because over the past month, this prison had been on lockdown because a gang inside the prison had risen up and overpowered the guards and completely taken over for this entire month. And just to be clear, during this month, people died as a result of this takeover. This was a horrible month for this prison, and it was only over the past couple of days that the guards were finally able to take back control. And Juan knew all this, not only because this riot was all over the news while it was going on, but also because his own son, Juan Jr., was serving time in this prison for robbery. He had been for the past year. However, Juan Sr. was not coming to visit his son right now. Instead, he was coming to visit a different prisoner, because during this riot, Juan Jr. had just disappeared. And Juan Sr., when he had found out about that, had called prison officials, other people, politicians, you name it, to try to figure out where his son went, but nobody seemed to know. And so finally, he had found this one prisoner, the guy he was meeting today, this beaten down looking guy, who had agreed to come forward and tell Juan Sr. what he knew about what happened to Juan Jr. And so Juan sat down at this table with this prisoner, and after the two of them introduced themselves, very quickly, Juan Sr. said, "Please, tell me what happened to my son, where is he?" But this prisoner he was talking to didn't immediately get into sort of a clear story about Juan Jr. This guy began talking about a totally separate prisoner, a man named Dorangel Vargas. Vargas was notorious across Venezuela for a series of brutal murders he committed that ultimately put him in this prison. And during this recent riot at this prison, it was Vargas and his gang that rose up and took over. Vargas was in charge, effectively, of the riot. And so even though he was terrorizing people and brutalizing people and was very much responsible for the deaths of multiple inmates, he also at the same time did have to make sure that, the people he was in charge of, albeit illegally, had enough food, they had enough supplies, that they had the things they needed to survive. And so again, he's sort of dictatorial and awful, but also, ensuring people have basic resources. And so Juan Sr. is listening to this man sort of lay this out about Vargas and sort of how he was in control during this riot. And Juan Sr. is like, I just don't get it. Why are you explaining the nuances of what he was doing during the riot? And this prisoner very quickly pointed to the bandage on his arm and kind of pointed at all of his injuries that were very obvious. And he told Juan Sr. that if anybody got in the way of Vargas while he was in charge during this riot, they were basically beaten to within an inch of their lives. And again, in some cases, people were killed. This was a brutal regime. And so Juan Sr. is like, oh my goodness, is that what happened to my son? Was he beaten like you by Vargas? But at that point, the prisoner just shook his head and said no. And then he looked down and almost couldn't make eye contact with Juan Sr. And he just said, what happened to your son was much worse. The prisoner would tell Juan Sr. that at some point during the riot, his son, Juan Jr., was tapped by Vargas to help with something. Now, it's not clear if Jr. went willingly or he was coerced, but we know that basically everybody had to do what Vargas asked them to do, otherwise they would be beaten or even killed. And so ultimately, Jr. agrees to help Vargas. And the thing he was tapped to help Vargas with was distributing food to the inmates. Because remember, despite how brutal Vargas was, he was in charge of providing basic necessities to all the inmates. And because of this riot, the prison had been locked down, and so food supplies had been restricted. And so inmates are beginning to starve, there's this big food shortage. And so Jr. was told, hey, you need to help us provide food to these inmates. And so Jr. basically agreed to do it, at which point he was informed exactly what role he was playing in finding food. Instead of going out and looking for this food, Jr. was the food. Vargas and his gang cornered Jr., beat him to death, butchered his body, and then literally fed him to the inmates. That's what happened to Juan's son. After hearing this horrific story, Juan Sr. was destroyed. And one of the first things he did is he went public and had this big press conference to tell the world about what happened to his son. But despite there being many eyewitness accounts, ultimately, the Venezuelan government denied the cannibalism and nobody was ever held accountable. Durangel Vargas remains incarcerated, and he's never been charged with any crimes connected to Junior's disappearance. Okay, as promised, here is today's special announcement. As of right now, we have a brand new show, a history podcast. But wait, it's not like a boring history show. This is not like, when you were in school and you had to sit through lectures about something that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago. It's not that. We're gonna pull from history, but we're gonna tell the true stories behind moments in history. We're gonna give you stories that feel like MrBallen stories with plot twists and crazy point of views. It's gonna be classic Ballen storytelling, but again, historical is the context. Here, let me give you an example. So if you look back and try to identify the first time true crime sort of became a thing, that the public was suddenly interested in a case that really had nothing to do with them just because it was entertaining, that case would be about this murderer who escaped. And that's kind of all that's available if you look it up. Yep, escaped murderer, that's when true crime became a thing. But did you know that that case, the escaped murderer, was way more compelling and exciting than most people give it credit for? People were interested at the time because there was this crazy transatlantic boat chase, and there was this crazy hunt for the killer, and the killing itself was so grisly, and that story really doesn't get told much. It's just kind of a statistic in a history book. And so what this podcast does is it finds cases like that and actually shows you why history is so cool and so interesting. And that's just episode 1. So this new history podcast is called A Twist of History, and it's live right now. So go to any platform where you get your podcasts and look up A Twist of History, or just search for Ballen Studios and you can find it that way. Follow the show and tune in each week. And if you really want to, give us a 5-star review. The show is totally free, new episodes every Wednesday. Oh, and one more thing, be sure to stick around till the end of today's YouTube video for a sneak peek of episode 1. At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in this shack with his father Rivelino, as well as his 2 younger brothers, who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room, only a few feet away. Raimundo and his family were very, very poor. The shack was very small. It was only composed of 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and also the kitchen, which was connected by a single door. And they were truly like out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money. They really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, there wasn't really much else to do here, his father, Rivelino, came into the room from the kitchen and he sat down next to him. And the two just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers. And as these 2 were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. And so he turned his attention and he looked into the dark kitchen and he saw this dark figure on all 4s quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified. He has no idea what this is. And so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. And at that point, the 2 younger brothers, they've woken up, and all 4 of them are looking at each other like, what's going on? And Raimundo, he says to his dad, what was that? Now, it was clear that Rivelino was very unsettled by whatever this was. They didn't have pets. There was no other people inside of their shack. There shouldn't be anything alive inside of the shack beyond them. So he doesn't know what it is. He's scared, but he tells his boys, it's okay. It's all right. I don't know what that is, but let's just stay here, we're safe. The door is locked, we're all here, we're safe. And so the boys, they all just kind of trusted their dad, and everybody just kind of hunkered down together and just sat there quietly, kind of waiting to see if they would hear anything else. And for a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Rivellino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. And at first, they couldn't really tell what these voices were saying. They were kind of garbled. But eventually, they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there, or whatever was out there, was talking about Rivellino. Specifically, they could hear that name. And what they were kind of saying is, if Rivellino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And the moment that all the boys sort of picked up the fact that somebody's out there and they're threatening to harm Rivellino, they're all like, Dad, what do we do? What do we do? And Rivellino, I mean, he's hearing this too, but he tells his boys, it's okay. I don't know what's going on out there, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This is a prank. This can't be real. And so Rivellino told his sons their plan is they're just gonna stay put. They're in this room, they're safe, the door is locked. We are gonna wait until the sun comes up, and then we'll figure out who did this, who's playing this prank on us. And so sure enough, Rivellino and his sons would stay in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m. when the sun began to come up again. And at that point, Rivellino told his sons to stay put, and he was gonna go out there and investigate. And by this point, they had stopped hearing voices. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. It sort of felt like whatever that was, whoever that was, had passed. And so, the tension is gone, and the boys are like, okay, be careful out there, Dad. And so Rivellino, he walks over to the door that leads into the kitchen. He unlocks it, opens it up, and Raimundo, he's craning his neck, looking into the kitchen, but, he can't see anything moving around in there, even with the light coming in. And so Rivellino, he says, okay, boys, stay here. And then Rivellino goes out into the kitchen and shuts the door behind him. And while he's out there, Raimundo and his brothers, they're all listening anxiously, making sure their dad's not in trouble, but they just hear the sound of their dad just clearly walking around the kitchen. There's no commotion, there's nothing. And then a couple of minutes later, Rivellino comes back into the main room where the boys are, and he's got a knife in hand, but he tells them, it's okay, I got this from the kitchen, I'm just in case. There's nothing out here. I'm now going to go outside and just make sure nobody's outside the hut, okay? So again, stay put. I'll be right back. And so again, the boys, they're looking at their dad like, okay, we'll see you soon. Rivellino walked out again into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him. And then the boys heard the sound of the door that led outside open up. And then presumably Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder. And this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story. Far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father, he opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and as soon as he did, he looked towards the door that led outside, and he saw it was wide open. And he saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out this smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad just kind of walking into this cloud, and then the smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad. His dad was gone. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, like, Dad, where are you going? And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. He just felt like, you can't go out there. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. Raimundo sprinted around his house, calling out for his dad, looking everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched this search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search, and then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. Also, people have no idea what that dark figure was skittering across their kitchen floor the night before Rivellino went missing, or who those voices were threatening to kill Rivellino, or the objects that Raimundo apparently saw floating in the sky spitting out yellow smoke. Nobody has any idea what any of that stuff is. All we know is Rivellino disappeared and 6 months later turned up dead in that crevice. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close. They had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents had gone through a really messy divorce, and during it, their father had just walked out on them and they never saw him again. And shortly after that, their mother remarried and her new husband moved in with the family, and shortly after that, their mother just vanished. And the boys, they asked their stepfather, like, where is she? Where's she gone? But the stepdad would say, I don't know, she went out on an errand and she never came back. And the boys, they were very suspicious of their stepfather because this did not feel like something their mom would do. Like, she would not abandon them. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. And so all of a sudden, these teenage boys are just left to fend for themselves. Now, the boys would contact police, and specifically they said, like, hey, we think something happened to our mom. We think maybe our stepdad had something to do with it, but everybody's abandoned us. And the police would launch an investigation and they would go looking for their mother, but they couldn't find her. And they couldn't find the stepfather or the biological father. And so after the police wound down their investigation, the two boys, again, they've been orphaned now and they, learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City for their mother, and they just could never get any sort of closure. They really didn't know what happened to her. And so today, the two brothers had met up, not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. So after their mother and stepfather and their biological father had abandoned them, the two boys had lived in the childhood home on their own, fending for themselves. They had grown up there. And then eventually, when they were old enough, they had moved out and started their own adult lives on their own, but they had never sold the house. They had just kind of kept it in their possession and let it sit there. But now they were going back to, go through and sort of clean it up and, decide if they wanted to do some renovations and just kind of fix the place up, maybe to sell it. They didn't know. And so the two brothers, they met up at the home, they go inside and, there's still photos on the wall, old family photos. And there's, all these memories that come rushing back, many of which are very sad and troubling. But, like the brothers, they're having a good time, just kind of going down memory lane. And at some point they decide, okay, you know what? Not only are we going to clean this place out, but also there's some basic renovations that really need to happen here. Like the place has been sitting here for years. It's sort of fallen into disrepair. Let's fix this place up. And so over the next couple of days, they would call in some contractors to begin to do some basic renovations in the house while the brothers continued to clean it up and pack things up and sort of get it ready for whatever it was going to be. And on one particular day, when a group of contractors were working in the master bedroom, the brothers were in the living room doing their own thing, when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. And so the two brothers, they got up, they bolt into the master suite, and they look at something that was just sitting on the ground. And at first, they didn't even know what they were looking at. But then the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was. And suddenly, the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It would turn out the brothers were right. Their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day their mother left and never came back again, somehow or another, she was bound and gagged and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. And we know this because when that contractor 2 decades later was doing renovations for the brothers inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite, and when he pulled it out again, a white object came tumbling out of the wall. And that object was their mother's skull. And after pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they would find the rest of her skeleton clearly bound and gagged. And then perhaps most disturbingly of all, is that in the wall, they would also find all these scratch marks, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, which means she was in there desperately trying to get the attention of her sons to save her, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the two brothers went to police in Mexico City and told them what happened. And the police would come to the house, they would look all over the place and try to figure out, what happened to their mother, who killed her. but they couldn't solve it. Now, the police always did suspect that the stepfather very likely had some level of involvement here, just given the fact that he himself went missing a couple of days after the mother did. But they could never locate him, and very likely they never will, because today he'd be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead. And now, from Ballen Studios, here is a clip of our newest podcast called A Twist of History. After you listen, be sure to look up A Twist of History on whichever podcast platform you listen to and give us a follow and start tuning in. New episodes drop every Wednesday.
It's July 9th, 1910 in London, England. A 16-year-old boy flies down 4 flights of stairs of a concrete office building and steps out onto Borough High Street on the south bank of the River Thames. The noise hits him immediately. People rushing down the sidewalk, the road filled with a mix of horse-drawn buggies and rattling automobiles. The street is so crowded it overwhelms the boy. He quickly pulls his hat down further to partially cover his face and starts weaving his way through the foot traffic. He darts his eyes back and forth, convinced that someone is going to recognize him. He can feel his heartbeat all the way up in his ears. He keeps rushing and scanning the street, but nobody pays any attention to him, so the boy finally relaxes a little. He slows down to a normal walk and makes his way to the entrance of a nearby London Underground station. A few minutes later, the boy sees his father coming towards him, holding a single small suitcase. The boy greets his father, and they run down the steps together in the Underground, just in time to catch the next train. The boy watches the train doors close and the mass of passengers exiting. He looks around to make sure that he still hasn't been recognized by anyone and follows his father on board. As the train car continues to fill up, the boy and his dad lower their heads, avoiding eye contact with their fellow passengers. And finally, the train starts to roll down the underground tracks, and the boy and his father exhale. Their escape from England has begun.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 4 claustrophobia-inducing diving stories. Now, these 4 stories, even if you've heard or seen them before, they have been completely re-edited. So it's like a brand new viewing experience for everybody. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the like button while they're away on vacation, but instead of taking care of their house, simply burn it to the ground. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground that from rim to rim is hundreds of feet wide. If you hike down the crater to the middle, there's this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For the people that have been in there, they say it's unbelievable and it's like spacewalking. For young South African Dion Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman and explore it was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. By the time he was 17, he was racing cars and building motorcycles, and by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new activity, cave diving. Dion had logged about 200 dives before he was invited by a diving group to go to Bushman's Hole and explore it on Christmas break 1994. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, so about the halfway point of the cave, and they needed one more diver, and so Dion was thrilled to go. The dive was going great, but on the way up, as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Dion looked back at him, and Dion seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out. And then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Dion, and Dion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's Hole. This diver immediately stops the group above him, and he turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Dion. But Dion was sinking so quickly that this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Dion's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. When authorities were notified about what happened to Dion, they sent a robot down to the bottom of Bushman's Hole to just locate his body before they sent a person down there. But they never could find his body. They could only ever find his helmet. Dion's parents are devastated. They're never going to see their son again. And since they don't have a body to bury, they decide to go down to Bushman's Hole and put a plaque up next to the entrance to commemorate their son. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming the third person ever to reach this depth. Shaw touched down on the sloping bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel, took out his flashlight, and began swimming around the bottom. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. It was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface, and when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion died inside of Bushman and had never been recovered, any diver that went in there was keeping their eye out in case they saw him. Shaw examines Dion to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface, and he can tell that his hands have skeletonized as well as his skull, although his mask is still placed directly on his skull. But his wetsuit and his tanks had kind of kept the rest of his body pretty tight, which gave him some mass, which meant he'd be able to move him. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm gonna die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he ended up tying a line to Dion's body so he could be located again, and then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. On the way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt bad for this kid, and all he wanted to do was get him back on land to give back to his family, to give them some closure. And so when he got on the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and said, I'm gonna go back down and I'm gonna get him. And Shaw also called Dion's parents and told them, I am gonna retrieve your son. And his parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe they were going to get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for January 8th, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down, and a couple minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in who would stop about 100 feet above Dave, and then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth. Dave would put the body bag over Dion and then carry his body up to the first guy, who would turn around, bring the body up to the next guy, and the next guy to the next guy until Dion was out of the water. At 6:13 in the morning, Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's Hole. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he expected to. As soon as he got down, he shined his light and he found Dion's body. He went over to him, he got the body bag out, and he got to work. 13 minutes after Shaw had submerged, the diver who was slotted above him, that would be the first to receive Dion's body, began looking for signs that Shaw was done and was moving up towards him. But when he looked down, he saw Shaw's flashlight wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. And after a couple of minutes and still no movement, this diver begins going deeper and deeper to try to get a better look at Shaw to see what's going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Shaw was not moving. This diver immediately goes into rescue mode and starts going straight down to get to Shaw to try to help him if he still can. And as he's moving down, he hears this fizzling sound and he looks at his wrist and he can tell that one of his gauges has broken. And this gauge was vital to the dive and it meant he would not be able to get down there. And so with a heavy heart, he had to turn around and go back up. And because of the depth at which they were diving, he could not just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He needed to stop at various decompression stops along the way. But he had a slate, and on it he wrote in his grease pen, "Dave's not coming back." And he swam the slate up to the next diver who would have received Dion's body, but instead receives this slate. He takes the slate up to the next diver, to the next diver, to the next diver, all the way up to the surface.
Don's okay.
Dave's not coming back.
As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around Bushman's Hole, which included Dion's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned silence. No one could believe this was happening. And then after the silence, Dion's parents are beside themselves. Not only are they not going to see their son probably ever again, but they feel like they are somehow responsible for Shaw's death. Eventually, by the end of the night, all of the other divers that were in the water that day successfully exited the cave and were just fine. As for Shaw, much like Dion, there really wasn't a good way to get him out, and so everyone came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. Eventually, they did need to go down and collect their gear, so everybody goes down to the edge of Bushman's Hole, and before they begin retrieving all of the lines, they sang Amazing Grace in memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they notice all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Dion's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line, and he had managed to free Dion before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed and they floated to the surface. And so even though Shaw would die doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's cave for his family. After the two bodies were taken out, they noticed that the camera on Dave's head was still intact and it had filmed everything all the way through his final moments. And so they took the tape out and they watched it forward and backwards, slow-mo, frame by frame, and they analyzed it to the point where they understood what happened. When Shaw gets down to Dion, Dion's body that had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Shaw had not been able to free him the first time, somehow he's become unfree and he's now free floating. And Shaw is having a really hard time trying to control this free floating body, and his body is literally breaking apart in front of him. As Shaw is trying to wrangle his body, you can hear him start grunting, his breathing is getting elevated, and he's totally losing control of the situation, and the bottom of this cave is slanted, and it's all silty and muddy, and so in the camera you see all this mud and silt getting kicked around, and the visibility is very poor, and after it clears, you see Shaw has gotten completely tangled in some line that's also tangled on Dion. So basically, Dion has become his anchor. At this point, Shaw shifts his focus to try to get the lines off of himself, and you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air, and probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from narcosis, which is a condition that divers will run into where it's like you've drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and you're confused, and it's clear that he's becoming a little bit disoriented. And instead of going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save yourself, instead he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection, and then he gets out a pair of scissors, but he doesn't use them, he just holds them. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear you're not going to be able to get him out at this point, and with the scissors in hand that he never used, because again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and he's confused, he starts beginning to make his way over to the area where you can go back up, but he starts slowing down, his breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent, and then there's no more movement, and Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they are absolutely devastated about what happened to Shaw, and they feel very guilty, but at the same time, they're so excited because they get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They don't care what state his body's in. Just the fact that he's actually here, that their actual son is going to be in front of them was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on the fact that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently they had bought him a set of jockey underwear and he was wearing jockey underwear. As strange as it is, it was like they got to bond with their child one more time. As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. But that's not all. In addition to that podcast, under the Ballen Studios umbrella, there is a whole host of other podcasts that you can binge right now, and their content, all of them, fall into the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious category. For example, if you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, you should go check out my other podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear from some other voices within our studio, like Luke LaManna. Luke LaManna is a military veteran. He has a super iconic, really deep radio voice, and he has two shows. One is called Wartime Stories, where he basically looks at strange, dark, and mysterious wartime stories, and his other show is called Redacted, where he looks at information that used to be classified, and he dives into it with his military expertise and experience, and he basically shows you the lies and secrets and half-truths that the most powerful institutions in the world have been keeping from us. We also have shows that are just plain creepy and unsettling, like Bedtime Stories, hosted by Richard Weil, where he dives into the supernatural and cryptids and mysterious deaths. I mean, basically his whole kind of niche is things that keep you up at night. And then two other shows that fall into that sort of unsettling, creepy vibe are Late Nights with Nexpo, hosted by the famous YouTuber Nexpo, where he dives into true, crazy, scary stories. And then we also have another show called Run Fool, hosted by Rodney Barnes. And Rodney is like an icon in the horror genre at large. And on his show, he just dives into this wild, chilling lore, like horror lore. People love that show. Or if you're a history buff and you really want stories that are really rooted in the fabric of our timeline, I mean, stories that are truly historically accurate, but still strange, dark, and mysterious and crazy, well, check out A Twist of History, hosted by Joel. He's great voice. He's a very thorough host. Those stories all have really cool endings, big plot twists at the end. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, go check out these shows. You can look for them either by name or simply by looking for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. They are available right now. Enjoy. At 4 a.m. on February 25th, 2022, a 36-year-old father of three named Christopher Boudram woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine, and then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen, and by 5:30 a.m., he was out his front door, into his car, making the commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater, things like inspections or welding or just moving equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just 2 minutes drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Perea Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Perea Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these underwater pipelines that Perea Fuel used to get the oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Perea had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea, so 1,200 feet off the coast, and ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down, it would shoot across this long horizontal section, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore, where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Perea Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called berth number 6, and unlike the rest of Perea Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, this one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just sat idle. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use berth number 6, and so they put it into a sort of storage mode, where the vertical section of berth number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes. However, the other vertical section of berth number 6 that was closest to shore was first plugged up, like imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine like a huge pool toy. They basically jammed it inside of the vertical section, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight inside of this pipe. And then, once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then also what they did is they put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of berth number 6. To understand it, you got to picture something else. Okay, so imagine you're in the bathtub and you have a bucket, and you flip it upside down above the surface, so there's nothing inside of the bucket, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand under the bucket underwater and it will be dry. And so basically that's what this habitat was. Perea Fuel took a huge bucket, if you will, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical section. So there was a permanent air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this is because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example, today they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, which meant doing work on it, the divers could swim down, get inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing air. It was really kind of a luxury. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before and men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. And so they climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their gear, and then once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed, and so they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on, he dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface, he talked to the folks on the boat, they handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat, and then once he poked himself back up, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe, he reached down inside, and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific happened inside of that space. We don't know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate this big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal, and suddenly all this low pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of pipeline made contact with the extremely high pressure air that was inside of this habitat. And air likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so the second that seal was broken, the high pressure air in the habitat expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, all 5 men into the pipe, and it also began sucking in seawater. Basically everything was going in this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on, went from just standing outside the pipe to feet first flying into this pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater all over them. They're holding their breath, and so they get sucked down the vertical section, they turn the corner, and they get rocketed out to sea. They are on the 1,200 foot long section, the horizontal section, just blazing a trail. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow. It's 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. And so you gotta figure that all of them are expecting to die. But eventually the pressure in this pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several minute long breath hold, they eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some miracle, they came to stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket where they stopped. And so they come to a stop and they just start gasping for air, and then they begin yelling out to each other, and they realize all 5 of them are alive, and they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all. They're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their face. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking, they're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe, meaning his head was closest to the vertical section closest to shore, and all 4 other men were right below him. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself. Again, we can hear him on audio, and he told the others to calm down and link their feet onto the person below them's shoulders. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys were very badly battered at this point. I mean, they came flying in here surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up, but they finally make their way until they're all linked, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe. They also understood that there was limited air, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they begin this journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe. Pitch black. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way on a breath hold. And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head, he felt scuba tanks, 2 of them. And he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had an air tank. Now they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their head. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do, but this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so, with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they can with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the gauge. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going, and finally, after hours of this, that Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air. They'd get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach this air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. And he starts yelling to Christopher in the total dark to stop, but he didn't have a reason, and Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal is starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal that, hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you. And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further, but Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped up. And it was again another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe to actually pull himself out. It was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well, like there's nothing he can do. But luckily there was a chain that was dangling down in arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Perea Fuel had their emergency response team on site. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized, he's badly hurt, he still ran up to authorities and told them, all 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You got to go back down. You got to save them. But Ultimately, the authorities decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends who are literally banging the pipe, he can hear them, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself. And they stopped him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable, and they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface, but nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe, because all of the men died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks, and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Perea Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe. And so to finish this story, I'm going to show you the final footage taken by one of the divers, Kazim, who was the one who got the wrench and brought it back inside the habitat, handed it off, and then that wrench was used to push the lever, which created the vacuum. You'll see in this video that it looks like nothing is going on, and Kazim is just inside of this habitat and all the divers are fine, and then it's like his camera just turns black. What's happening there is he was pulled so quickly into the pipe that it looks like it was a cut of the camera, when in reality, that's just how fast everything inside of that habitat was pulled into the pipe. This video is highly distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Situated an hour's drive from Johannesburg in South Africa lies Sterkfontein Cave. The cave is famous for the fossils that have been found there and also for its underground lake, whose walls look like Swiss cheese. There's all these tunnels that spider all over the place. Many of them are unexplored, and no one knows how deep the cave actually goes. In 1984, cave diver Peter Verhussel, along with 2 of his friends, decided they wanted to explore these passageways in the lake, and specifically they wanted to check out a chamber called Milner Hall, which was fairly far down in the lake. There was a guideline that was anchored from the surface of the lake all the way down into the different sections that had been explored. And this was so cave divers could hold on to it and make their way through without getting lost. Not that I've ever been cave diving, but from what I've read, there is one golden rule. You never let go of the guideline. And if you do, it better be extremely well planned, and you should do it with other divers present. Peter was a notorious risk taker and was the least experienced cave diver of the three. When they entered the lake, they were all holding the guideline, and Peter was the third back. And so they began descending down into the lake, and at some point, Peter's curiosity got the better of him, and he left the line to go look at the wall where there was, something he wanted to look at. And luckily, the other two divers noticed it, they saw him, and they swam over and got him and brought him back to the guideline. And even though you can't communicate underwater, I'm sure they looked at him like, come on, don't do that. And they kept going down, and then once again, Peter's curiosity gets the better of him. He leaves the guideline and goes over and checks something else out. The other two divers notice again, they turn around, they grab him, and they pull him back. And now they're looking at him like, you can't do this, no more. And so Peter's body language indicated that he got it, and he was back on the guideline, he's not gonna do it again. And they continue down, and they're getting closer to Milner Hall when the first two turn around to check on Peter, and he's gone. And now previously, when they found him those other two times when he left the guideline, he was just over right against the wall, and he was easy to spot. But this time he wasn't. They're looking around with their lights, and he's nowhere to be found. And they're not prepared to go leave into one of these tunnels to go looking for him because there was so many. It was like Swiss cheese down there with all these different tunnels he could have gone into, and they didn't know which one he went in. And so after kind of waiting and looking around for a couple of minutes, thinking maybe he'll come back, they were running out of air and they had to go to the surface. So the two men surface, they call the police, they explain what happened. Rescue divers are sent to the cave to go looking for Peter, but by the time they even got there, it had been several hours. It takes a while to mount this type of search, and Peter only had one tank of air. And so if he hasn't surfaced by now, the thought is he's drowned at this point. But the rescue divers go into the lake, they head down to the area where Peter was last seen, and they look around and they can't find him, and they surface pretty quickly. And they say, look, we're just not prepared to look through all these different tunnels he could have gone in just to find his body. Because at this point, there's no way he's alive. He's been down here for hours. He doesn't have enough air. And one of the rescue divers is going to get trapped in one of these tunnels, and we don't want to lose anyone. So we're terminating the search. Peter's friends are devastated, and they say, hey, can you let us go down and look for Peter's body for his family? And the police said, no, we're banning diving in this cave. 6 weeks after Peter went missing inside of this lake, a group of dry cavers were doing some work in a chamber that was right next to this underground lake. And they were chiseling this wall when all of a sudden the wall kind of collapsed, revealing another chamber on the other side of this wall. They took their flashlight out and they looked inside, and it looked like a tunnel that kind of weaved around the corner. And they shined their light on the ground, and it looked like there were some muddy or sandy footprints that were left as if someone had been walking right there. The cavers were initially terrified, the idea that there's anything living behind the walls inside of a cave. But they stepped over and they walked around the corner, and it revealed this huge air pocket that clearly was connected to the underground lake, because there was water right in the middle of this air pocket, and there was no other way in besides, this wall that's collapsed. And in the middle of the water, there was this island. It was like this sandy, muddy, rocky island right in the middle of this air pocket. And laying on the island was Peter. In a stroke of luck, after Peter went missing from his dive, he had discovered this air pocket, and he had surfaced and climbed onto this island. He knew he didn't have enough air in his air tank to get to the surface again, and so he figured, okay, I'll just sit on this island. There seems to be enough air in here for me. I'll wait until my dive buddies invariably go get help and come down here and rescue me. He sat inside of that air pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for a rescue that never arrived. Before he ultimately died of starvation, he wrote a message in the sand to his mother and to his wife, telling them that he loved them. To this day, diving is still prohibited inside of Sterkfontein Cave. In 1938, a farmer in southeastern Australia decided to bring his horses to a watering hole on the other side of his large property. As he was leading the horses across this big, wide open field, one of his horses suddenly just collapsed to the ground. The farmer ran over to see what was going on, but as soon as he got over to it, the horse had stood back up again and seemed totally unhurt. The farmer was puzzled because he had no idea why the horse fell in the first place, and so he looked down to see if maybe it tripped on something, and he saw on the ground right beneath the horse was this small hole. And so he moved his horse out of the way, and then when he came back to look at this thing, he saw it was only maybe a foot across, but when he peered down into it, he saw it was very deep. And so he got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look, and when his eyes adjusted, he could not believe what he was seeing. 10 or 15 feet below the surface was this huge pool of clear water. The horse had just stepped into the roof of an underground cave. And so the farmer was really excited to see how big this cave was. And so he grabbed all his horses and he brought them back to the stable, and he got this long measuring rope with a weight at the end of it. So he runs back out to the hole, he puts the weight into the hole, and he begins paying out this rope. And so down it goes, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, it just keeps on going and going until finally the weight hits solid land at 120 feet. And so the farmer is like, wow, this is a huge cave. So he pulls it back up thinking that's the bottom, but in reality it wasn't. It actually extended down almost 300 additional feet. The farmer and his horse had just accidentally found one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world, called the Shaft. The reason it's called the Shaft is because the only way in or out of this underwater cave is through this hole in the middle of this field that this horse created, and it's literally a shaft that goes down 18 feet until it reaches the surface of this massive underground body of water. The opening to this shaft is so narrow that cave divers, they can't get into it with their gear on their backs. So they literally need to be lowered into this cave by themselves, and then their gear is lowered down after them, and they put it on while they're treading water. The solid ground that the farmer's weighted line had touched at 120 feet when he believed he had reached the bottom of the cave, what he had actually touched was the top of something called the rock pile. The rock pile is basically this huge underwater pyramid that looks like a rock pile that sits at the bottom in the middle of this huge underwater cave. And from the top of this rock pile, you can go down it in all different directions, but once you get to the bottom, there's only 2 tunnels to choose from. There's one that goes west, basically down at an angle that dead ends at 260 feet. And then on the other side of this underwater pyramid is the eastern tunnel, and that's much more treacherous. It goes down at a more steep angle to 400 feet. The few elite divers that have explored the deepest recesses of this cave say there are 3 distinct stages to it. Stage 1 is from the surface down to 120 feet, the top of the rock pile. During this stage, the diver swims unobstructed in beautiful clear water with sunlight poking through the hole. It's a very easy section of the cave. And there's a safety line that's anchored from the surface straight down to the top of the rock pile. So you have something to hold on to as you go down and back up. Stage 2 is where things get a bit dicey. Stage 2 begins at the top of the rock pile and extends down all the way to the bottom of the westerly tunnel at 260 feet where it dead ends, or down to the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel where you come to something called the drop-off ledge. And it's quite literally a ledge in the middle of this tunnel where beyond it there's a fairly steep drop-off, and it leads down to an area that's so treacherous it's got its own stage. Starting with stage 2 and then with stage 3, there is no safety line to guide you in the direction you need to go. So you're on your own as soon as you reach the top of the rock pile. And so you make your way down any direction you want down the rock pile until you reach either of these tunnels, and as soon as you go into them, you immediately start to lose visibility because the sunlight cannot penetrate all the way into these tunnels. And so the diver becomes increasingly reliant on their flashlight. As such, they have to be very careful as they navigate down stage 2 to not bump into the walls, because doing so will knock the limestone silt off of the walls. It will create a cloud of it in their face. It will blind them. It's like being in fog where a flashlight can't push through it. And so the diver has to either wait for the silt to clear, which could take a very long time, or they have to swim blind. Also, anyone entering stage 2 and stage 3, they can't breathe regular air out of their tanks. There's too much nitrogen in regular air. The deeper you dive, the more nitrogen your body will absorb, and if you have too much nitrogen in your system, it can give you something called nitrogen narcosis, which is like being really drunk. And in extreme cases, people have been known to take their mouthpiece out and inhale water, believing they're on the surface, or they'll confuse the direction up with the direction down, and to get to the surface, they will swim straight down until it's too late and they can't get back up again. And so divers that are going to be in stage 2 or stage 3 of this cave will breathe a special mix of gases that are low in nitrogen. The final stage of the shaft, stage 3, is just from the 200-foot mark of the easterly cave, so that drop-off ledge, all the way down to the bottom at 400 feet. This stage is unbelievably dangerous. As soon as you drop off that ledge, all the sunlight goes away. It is pitch black, and the tunnel narrows considerably and stays incredibly narrow. In fact, many times divers have to squeeze themselves past sections where the rocks are too close together. And so because you're inherently bumping into the walls all through stage 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to be silted out the entire time. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed, even if you're breathing a special low nitrogen mix of gases. And so divers need to be ready to abort the dive at any moment if they feel symptoms coming on. Once the diver has turned around and is making their return trip, but they're still in the 3rd stage section of the cave, they need to be careful of false domes. These are offshoots on the ceiling only in this 3rd stage that look like the way out. And especially when things are silted out and it's dark, you're low on oxygen, you might be panicking, it'd be very easy to confuse these with the way out. But in fact, these false domes are exactly what their name implies. They are false. They are dead ends. They go nowhere. Stage 3 is reserved exclusively for extremely experienced cave divers who get special permission. In 1973, 8 divers got permission to dive the 1st and 2nd stages of the shaft cave. They did not get permission to dive the 3rd stage of the cave. On May 28th of that year, the 8 divers arrived in that big open field near the cave opening and began prepping their gear. Their plan was to dive down all the way to the edge of the drop-off ledge, so looking into the 3rd stage, and then once they got there, look around for a minute and then turn around and head back up to the surface. These 8 divers were experienced divers, but their experience was all in open water environments. None of them had dove in a cave. And so they were confident divers, but they were a little bit naive. They believed the dive down to the edge of the 3rd stage was going to be fairly routine and would just be simple and fun. But before any of them had even gotten into the water, they had already made a critical mistake. Instead of jamming their bottle with the special low nitrogen mixed gas that they would need since they were going into stage 2, and so that's a requirement, instead of doing that, they just jammed their bottles with regular air. So they were basically guaranteeing that they would get nitrogen narcosis. But once they had all their gear prepped, they made their way over to the entrance to the shaft, and one by one they were lowered down into the water and their gear would follow. And then once all of them were all jocked up, they grabbed the safety line and they began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes to get down to the top of the rock pile, and there they spent about 5 minutes taking pictures of each other before heading down the eastern tunnel. 3 of the divers were siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine, who were 25, 22, and 19 respectively. And Glenn remembers after they made their way all the way down the eastern tunnel and they reached the drop-off ledge, he remembers seeing his sister, his brother, and all the other divers. Everyone seemed just fine. Everyone's just looking over this ledge. They're taking turns, kind of peering down into this black abyss that is stage 3. And then after 5 minutes or so, Glenn looked at his gauge and he saw his air was getting fairly low. Not emergency situation, but it was time to leave. And everybody else had the same amount of air as he did, and so everybody else was running low on air. And so Glenn was about to grab his sister, who was several feet right in front of him. She was still looking over the ledge down into stage 3, but when he reached out to grab her, she and all the other divers just suddenly jumped forward and dove straight down into the abyss out of sight. They dove into the stage 3 section. This was not something that Glenn was tracking anybody doing. This was not something anyone said they were going to do. This was not part of the dive. This was very dangerous and they weren't allowed to go down there. And so Glenn immediately swam down after them to try to grab his sister and stop her, or grab his brother, or grab any of them. But as soon as he went over that ledge, he saw it was totally pitch black and it was completely silted out from all these divers suddenly launching over the edge. And so Glenn knows he's not going to find them in the silt. It's also very dangerous for him alone to just dive down there. And so he figures, you know what, I'm sure they're fine. They probably planned this out and they're just going to go down a little ways and they'll come back up again. And so I'll just go to the rock pile and wait for them. And so Glenn turns around and he goes up back over the drop-off ledge. He makes his way to the rock pile and he just sits there facing the eastern tunnel, waiting for his brother, his sister, and the other divers to come back out again. But they don't. And finally, his air gauge gets so low that he literally has to go to the surface. And he's thinking to himself, if my air is this low, what are they doing down there? 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers that went with Glenn's sister and brother and the other 2 divers into this forbidden 3rd stage section of the cave. Although he doesn't say this, it sounded like he and the others just wanted to go a little ways into this off-limit section, check it out, and then turn around and go back to the surface. And so Larry would say, as soon as they went over the ledge and they're in this 3rd stage, it went completely pitch black and the tunnel immediately constricted dramatically. And so as they're going down this very tight and pitch black tunnel, they reach a section that's so tight, they're down on their stomachs, literally pulling themselves through. And so after a few minutes of the group forcing themselves into this unbelievably dangerous place, it's like they all collectively realized, this is a terrible idea, we need to turn back. And so as they all began turning around, they realized their return trip just back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only maybe 25 feet, was completely silted out. And so Larry is in the back of this return trip line, and right in front of him is Christine. And so as soon as they all make their way into the silt, the only thing Larry can see with his flashlight is Christine's fins. And so he's staying right up on her and keeping his light on that fin to make sure he's going in the right direction. And so after only a few moments, Christine's fins just suddenly disappear. And so Larry's thinking, I don't know where she went, but I don't have enough time. I have almost no air. And so he just keeps on swimming, believing he's going the right way. And sure enough, he clears out of the silt and he goes up and back over the drop-off ledge, and he shines his light back up the eastern tunnel, back up towards the rock pile, expecting to see Christine and the other divers he was just with. But he's looking and there's no one there. There's no silt, it's totally clear, and there's not one diver in front of him. And so he looks at his gauge again, and he's got a little bit of air, enough to maybe go down and make sure nobody is still down there. Because he's thinking, I don't think it's possible they could have swam all the way through this tunnel in this space of time. So he turns around, he goes back over the drop-off ledge, back into the silt, and as he's moving very slowly and cautiously, up ahead he sees flashlights moving around on the ceiling of the tunnel. And so he moves down towards this flashing light, and he realizes the light is coming from inside of a false dome right above him. And so he looks up, and he saw there was Christine and another man named Roberts, who was 28, frantically swimming around, shining their lights, looking for the way out, not realizing they're in this dead end. And so Larry was about to shine his light to get their attention when Larry's flashlight went out. And so now Larry is in complete darkness. He is completely silted out. He doesn't even know how much air he has left because he can't shine the light on it. And so he's starting to panic. He starts banging on his flashlight, and finally the light comes back on. And when it does, he shines it straight up again to try to shine it towards Christine and Roberts, but he had drifted farther down the tunnel. And so by the time he shined his light, he wasn't underneath the false dome. But when he shined his light in the other direction, he saw he was at the very far end of where the group had gone. And so farther down into stage 3 was clear. There was no silt. And so he shined his light down into the stage 3 tunnel, and way down the tunnel, barely visible, he sees there is one diver with his flashlight out swimming the wrong direction down into oblivion. His name was John, he was 20 years old, and he almost certainly had nitrogen narcosis. Larry knew he could not save him, and so Larry turned around and went back into the silt, back up in the direction of the rock pile, touching the ceiling, looking for that entrance into the false dome to try to help Christine and Roberts. But he's not finding it, and he's looking at his air gauge, and it's getting critically low, and he knows if he doesn't go soon, he's gonna die. And so at some point, after not finding the entrance to this false dome, he decides he just has to go out and save himself. And so he manages to get out of the silt. He goes up and over the drop-off ledge. He gets to the rock pile. He grabs the safety line, and he fins himself up to the surface. And when he gets to the surface, he looks around, and there's only 3 other divers up there, one of which is Glenn. And Glenn, he looks visibly panicked, and he yells to Larry, "Hey, have you seen my brother and my sister? Have you seen the others? Are they coming up after you?" And Larry looks at him and just shakes his head. He didn't know what to say. He knew they were gone. But for Glenn, this was his baby brother, his baby sister. He had to go back down. And so with the little bit of air he had left, he put his mouthpiece in, he turned around, and he dove straight down as fast as he could, staring towards the opening of the eastern tunnel, praying that his family members, that his friends are going to come out of there. But as he's swimming down and he's running out of air, no one was coming out of that tunnel. And so finally, when his air was basically empty, he had to turn around, and on that return trip back to the surface, he realized his siblings and his 2 friends were gone. It would take 11 months and 11 days to finally locate and recover all 4 of the bodies inside of the cave. John, the 20-year-old who Larry saw swimming in the wrong direction, was found fairly far down the eastern tunnel, laying on a rocky outcropping. Glenn's 22-year-old brother Stephen was found just 50 feet from the entrance of the shaft, but it's believed he died at a much lower depth and then floated up to that position. Glenn's 19-year-old sister Christine and the 28-year-old man Roberts that she was with inside of the false dome were found embracing each other just under the false dome inside of the tunnel. Investigators believe when they were in there, they couldn't find the exit and then realized that they had so little air that even if they found the exit, they would not get out in time. And so knowing they were just minutes away from death, they abandoned looking for the exit and instead just embraced each other while they died. And then afterwards, they floated down and out of the false dome. After this tragedy, the shaft was permanently closed to all divers, but years later, they would reopen it. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.